too quiet. I don't know if you saw my post on the bargain on the coffee Keurig. Huh? The Keurig coffee. Hold it up, darling. This is at Bargain Brothers. That thing sells for $26, and we give more than that at Sam's. There's 48, which is, I think, one of the bigger ones. I got them for $4. I ended up with about 10 or 12 cases of it. It looks like the Lord's Supper, so I think we're going to trade it out. You know what gets me is, in Florida they used to make their own Lord's Supper, and sometimes it would be chewy, sometimes it would be dark, sometimes you have to rip it apart. We kind of look forward to Sunday, but also some of the remarks were just absolutely rude to the people that had done it. But stop and think about the old, what we would consider to be the Lord's Supper of the Old Testament, taken with bitter herbs. And we kind of complain. We talk about how we don't like it. It tastes like cardboard. It's too small. But we went to a congregation at Rainbow City with Rachel. I went last Sunday or the Sunday before, and they still hand it out. And brethren, it's not the same. There's just something about that communion, the joining together in that. Nothing wrong with it, nothing whatsoever. But I like the way that we've gone back to. So anyway, all right. Oh, it is. Yeah. But see, a lot of people grew up with an old Ringer washing machine, and I guarantee you they don't want to go back. And I guarantee you don't want to go back and get away from your zero-turn machine. And I don't want to go back to a 1955 Pontiac Star Chief, my first car, that had no air conditioning. And I could not understand why. I think that I'd gone to every junkyard and bought every water pump that there was for that Pontiac. One fella finally said, after I sold it, well, you had a fan blade that was out of whack. And so the fan being out of balance would wear the water pumps. I know that now. All right, give us an update, Shelley, on your daughter and baby. Baby's doing great. Okay. Okay, and that's your daughter? Yeah, okay. So keep them in your prayers. Rick came and sat down and said, well, we were looking at pictures of the baby. And I was thinking, well, that's nice. No, it was a cow. So if you want to see the new baby cow,
what kind of baby?
Go to Greg. Well,
He's going to have a baby.
So if you want to see the cow, go to Greg. If you want to see the baby, go to Shelley. All right, another thing that needs to be emphasized, it may not affect that many in this group, but Christian Cherry is coming. He is the youth minister that our elders in this congregation is looking at. Saturday morning from 9 till 10, there'll be coffee and pastries. The elders and their wives will meet with him at noon over at Marion's. He is staying with Rodney and his wife. That evening at 5 o'clock, the youth group and the Kids for Christ and the adults that would like to come, and we encourage you to come, will come to the building for pizza, games, song, and Devo from Christian. That's a religious name, but man, when I see Christian there, it's a hard name for me. On Sunday, do what? Yeah. You call Michael Whitworth, you call him Mike, he'll dress you out right then and there. My name is Michael. Okay, Mike. Then Sunday morning, Christian will give us a lesson. He'll be teaching the youth, and everyone that would like to is welcome to go into that class, and I encourage you to do that and get to know them. And then after service on Sunday night, he's going out with a Cornerstone to eat at Slim's, Slim Chicken.
Is he a dead deal?
No. He's a, what? Oh, yeah, Jeff's dad had to go back in the hospital. His mother is also in the hospital, and Jeff had to drive back down there. And so be mindful. We think we're stressed out because Donna's mother, who will not allow text on her phone, Rachel was wanting to use her credit card to buy prescriptions for Donna's mother. And so Rachel went through the hoopla, you've got to call the bank and so, and they'll call you back and give you a number. And they called back, and the automatic number started saying 280, 280, 280. And she just hung up on them. She had no earthly idea what they were doing. So she just hung up on them. But do you think that when we get into our 80s, that there will be things that are strange and that we do not want to adjust? There is with me. I give it a little bit of time, and then I'm through. I hate passwords with a passion. Yeah. Do what? I need AI. All right, so those are the two that we have. And also I want you to remember and keep remembering Philip Glenn. Philip's going through a lot of pain, and he's our brother in Christ, and we're going to stand beside him. All right, be turning, if you will, to the book of Ezekiel 12. Now we're going to try and we've got to be through by the 1st of November, or December, September, October, November, December. And so what we'll do is we'll hit some high points. One is going to be in the book of Ezekiel 16, and the other one is going to be in the book of Ezekiel 34. And in that you see who is the head of the home. Let's just assuming that you're married. Who's the head of the home? Whoever the wife says it does. That was John, Melissa. God said it is the husband, but now always remember that Christ is the head of the church, and we are the head of the house, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he gave himself for it. And so you've got that comparison that's made. So the husband will be called into account of how he has run his house, right? It's at the point where we're almost afraid to say, well, then, you hate women. No, God was the one through Christ who gave women their value. He stood up for women. He valued women. He told culture how to treat women. And so in the book of Ezekiel 34, you're going to have God who calls into account his shepherds. And we'll compare 34 with John 17, John 10. And look at the value. And I think one reason that God is so hard on leaders is that they lead who? Who do our elders lead, shepherd, mentor, responsible for? God's children. God's children are worth what? They're priceless. God gave his Son to give us our value. And so we've got to remember that as we interact with each other. And that's not easy. It's not easy being a part of the church. There's a constant changing. There's a constant challenging in our lives for fellowship. All right, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 12, verses 1 through 20. And I want us to do this with the idea of 2 Peter chapter 3, beginning in verse 7 through about 9. In 2 Peter chapter 3, 7 through 9, they had come to the point where they thought God had delayed everything for so long that it was just a lie. He was not coming. And Peter says that God is not slack concerning his promises, but is long-suffering to usward, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And I would write 1 Peter or 2 Peter 3, 7 through 9 out there in my margin. Because the chapters we're going to be looking at is the false prophets would come in, and notice what he says. They spoke from their own hearts. They did not have a revelation from God. God had not spoken to them. And you notice that, you contrast it. Just notice in the reading that you have read and should have read, how many times does it say, and the Lord spoke to me, and the Lord said? And so you've got false prophets who by now were saying that the prophecies, because they had not come true so far and it had been such a long time, that they were just not true. The prophets were lying. And so you have people like Ezekiel, and it'd be worth you underlining, and the Lord said, the Lord came to me. Just when you find that, and that is their idea of putting God up there as the one who's behind it. Brethren, when people speak and we listen, when God speaks, we ought to be very careful how we listen to what he's saying. And so you've got the condemnation of the false prophets who did not receive a revelation from God. They were speaking from their own hearts, both men and women, opposed to people like Ezekiel, who the word of the Lord came to me and said. And so there in chapter 12, beginning in verses 1 through 20, you have the idea that the exile's coming, the prophecies are coming. How long to a child when you say to a child, at 2 o'clock we'll go get an ice cream, and the child waits and waits and waits and waits and waits and waits. How long do they wait? 30 seconds. And I was kind of looking at this, and I'm thinking at the times that most of the time when you're younger, well, at a certain time we'll do this, and it seemed like forever. John's just retired. And he'll let you know, if you want some money in the bank, you have to put it in there and wait how long? How long, Wayne? No, before you get 40 years, 50 years. Man, does it pay off if you do it right. If you listen to a good prophet, because you got prophets out there in the financial business that could not care less about your money. They care about the commission they make on an initial investment. And so here you find that in chapter 12, he's saying that the events are going to come that you say are not coming. And so there in the beginning of chapter 12, he says, "And the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man." And that's a unique expression used for Ezekiel. "You dwell in the midst of a rebellious house." Has that been a reoccurring theme? Of Israel being rebellious, chapter 1, verse 8. I'm sure that a lot of them lived just like us. They believed that they were good. They believed they were honest. They believed that they were in harmony with God. But through an unchecked life, and not only that, the people were deceived, and the false prophets were deceived. And so it was the deceived deceiving the deceived. And they're both guilty. You will not stand before God and say, "Mike the preacher said this." I have a responsibility. Every one of us has a responsibility to come to an understanding. And I would rather you come to an understanding that's your conviction that's different to simply believing in me. And your conviction be different than mine. I have a lot of respect for that. You know, a lot of time in the church, well, we've all got to speak the same thing. And brethren, let me tell you what that's talking about, if you haven't heard of it. When Paul says you all speak the same thing in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 through 12, he's talking about who the Christ is. One says, "I'm of Charles," and the other one says, "I'm of Rick," and the other one says, "I'm of Greg." You may have been their mentors, you may have been their teachers, you may have baptized them, but you're not the Christ. There are people in Washington County to go to certain churches because they are recognized with the name. Who would you hang out with? Peter or Paul? Oh man, it depends on what day it is with Peter. But Peter was still, poor old Peter was trying. But we like to be associated. I was baptized by Mike Raine. Well, I've never heard of him. And then I was baptized by so-and-so, and somehow we think that gives our baptism and our identity greater praise. I'm going to preach a lesson on this, and I really thought about it while I was up in North Carolina. The expression that Paul uses in the book of 2 Corinthians, "And only the Lord stood with me." You realize that every friend that Paul had deserted him? And I'm not going to preach that sermon, but those words hit me. At times that we're in difficult times and people seem to desert us, and God never, ever does. All right, so those that dwelt in this rebellious house, Israel, who have eyes to see, but they see not, who have ears to hear, they hear not, for they are a rebellious house. As for you, son of man, Ezekiel, prepare for yourself an exile's bag. And so what God has done, and Bobby kind of started this, the clawing through the wall, And then when they get through the wall, there is a vision, there's something to see. This shadow and this figurative type speech, symbolic speech, continues. Remember, this has not taken place. This is all in a vision. And so God says, I want you to pack your bag. And I want you to do it in the day. I want you to come back at night. Why? What was on the other side of that wall that Ezekiel was digging through in this particular chapter? The what? Run that by me again, Greg. Other people, the Israelites. What else? Who? Abomination. He's going out and he's coming in, and he's doing it with what he calls the exile baggage. Everything that was valuable to them was going to be lost when not Ezekiel, but they go through that wall. And they were going into exile. Man, when you see something, every morning they looked like that there was he looked Hawaiian, looked like he was about 150 years old, and he ran every morning. Do you remember seeing him? Huh? And he'd always do this to you. That's why I don't run. And you think, why? What? Or if you see someone doing something unusual, and it's often, how in the world do you see that and not question it? And this is what God is saying. You go out during the day, you come back during the night. And then they came to him, the leaders came to him and asked him, what in the world? And in chapter 12, he's simply saying, you are going to be held accountable. You're going into exile. And again, we have some killed by the sword. We have some killed by famine. In the next chapters, he talks about some of you are going to die with the beast and the pestilence. Some of you are going to starve to death. But you're not going to get away with what you've done. Rebellious. And so in chapter 12, you have this. You have him, 3 and 4, being an example to those people. And they were not going to escape. And one of the beautiful things is that, look in verse 7. So you have God coming to Ezekiel. You have him speaking to Ezekiel. You have him when he does talk, he says, and I once heard a preacher, and he quoted Acts chapter 2, and he went on and he preached his sermon. And at the end of it, he apologized for the long reading. How does that come across to the brethren? How should it come across to me as a child of God? When a man reads a chapter of the Bible to start his sermon and then apologize for the long reading. Is there something wrong with that? The apology ought to be, I'm sorry that I didn't let God speak more often. And so you have this with Ezekiel. Ezekiel, you are going to be an example. You're going to be an example to the people. And in verse 7, and I would note carefully this, and I did as I was commanded. I brought out my baggage by day as baggage of exile. And in the evening, I dug through the wall with my own hands, and I brought out the baggage at dusk, carrying it on my shoulder in their sight. And so the idea is here, you're going to be held accountable. You're going to go into exile. And so all...
Just back up one verse to where it says, you'll pile so much junk on yourself that you can't even see the brain.
Uh-huh.
So he wouldn't be able to tell them where they were going. Because that would nullify that question. If someone actually had the question, well, Ezekiel, you say we're going to be exiled. You say where are we going to go?
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't be able to tell them because he doesn't know because he can't even see his feet. The Lord is leading. That's the part that's true.
All right, you've got that, but he also tells them, you cover your heads. Those that are going into exile had to cover, because they were not allowed to see the land. Even though, they went into the land, they just did not get to see it. And so from 21 to 28, you have the fallacy there, the foolishness of just completely ignoring the prophecies. Is the Lord coming back? Yes. When? We don't know. How effective do you think it is when I, as a preacher, talk about, you don't know when you're going to go, the Lord may come back today, and you've heard that for 40 years from me. Does it lose its effectiveness? To the point where, well, here's the invitation. But in the latter part of chapter 12, he is telling them that when you ignore, and the Hebrew people had been so deceived that they had ignored the prophecies. It's kind of like, time goes on and on and on. So keep that in mind, even though what they were talking about here in these prophecies took place within about 8 years, or about 6 years. All right, let's go to 13. Well, let me just stop here in a minute. When did he say that these things would come?
They were saying, you've been saying this stuff, but it's not going to happen.
Okay.
We're not going to worry about it. And he turns right back around in 28 and said, there's none of my words be prolonged anymore. The word which I have spoken shall be done, said the Lord God.
All right. In their lifetime. They were about to see it. And we discussed that from Matthew 24. Lord, tell us when these things are going to happen. And the Lord begins to describe it, and he goes on, he talks about it, and he says, you will see all of these things. Not some of it now, some of it later. You'll see it happen in your generation, 40 years. And so they were at the point where it's just not going to happen, and the Lord says, you're going to see it happen. It's going to take place in your lifetime. And brethren, us living a Christian life is not getting ready for heaven. It's living to be like our Lord, and it's a joy. It's an absolute joy. Do we have to remind ourselves that we are children of God? Mike knows where I'm going with this one. All right, so I get my coffee for $4. Just on that first trip, I saved $210. Do you drink a lot of coffee? Not really. In the morning I do. Here I grind it myself. But I like to make a gift of it. Helen was asking about it. No, I'm not selling it, Helen, but you get a box. Or did you get one? All right, you want another one? If you want another one, get it. And so I go back, I think, man, if I'm getting it for $4, guess what I can get it for tomorrow? $2. So I go up there and $2 a day. A line you would not believe. But when I walked in, there was some more McDonald's coffee. I went over there and I got 3 boxes. I pulled them to myself. I had my bag. I was going to get them and put them into my bag. And someone who pretended he didn't speak English reached across and got my 3 boxes of coffee and put them in his bag. And I said, "Hey, those are mine." He didn't make any difference whatsoever. I don't understand what you're saying. You talking to me? I had a knife in my pocket, and I could have stuck the top of his hand, but I had to remind myself that I was a child of God. I wonder if they'll have them next week or next month. I guarantee you they will. God will bless us. And so these people had just taken, and not only that, a lot of their baggage, so that they could not see, was their deception of the false prophecies. When Ezekiel was saying these things are going to happen, what were the false prophets saying? Jeremiah said, "You're going to be in this situation for 70 years. The false prophets came along and said it'll be 7. And God talks about their prophecies were lies. So Ezekiel comes along, and while he is saying there's going to be trouble, there's going to be judgment, you're going into exile, and even in exile, you go into exile again, they're saying peace. There's peace in the land.
So were they making us these things, or did they actually think they saw them on the vision? Did they make up those visions, or did they actually think they had the vision?
Well, number one, they had. The Bible makes it clear that God here did not, and they did not have visions, but they listened to their own hearts. Brethren, we've got it, and we even have it in the Church of Christ, where the preacher believes that he's the prophet. Hebrews chapter 1 says that there was a time that God spoke to our forefathers. He has spoken to the apostles, the writers of the New Testament, and that's it. And so God would appear like he did to Ezekiel. The Lord has said to me. He showed himself last night. You have Daniel saying the same thing in the lion's den, did he not? The Lord appeared unto me. You have Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, same thing. God said, I'll protect you. But all the way through these chapters, all the way through 16, you have the comparison of people like Ezekiel who said, God spoke to me, and the other ones who listened to their own hearts, which God said was a lie. I believe that people can deceive themselves, Rick. I had a man who walked forward once and was baptized, and I asked him why. I'd worked with him for a long time. And I preached in one of those old-timey churches that had pecan paneling. You remember those? All the way around the building. I had one member who actually told me how many pine knots were in our roof while I was preaching. He was counting the knots in our roof. But this man told me, he said, do you see up there? There is an angel. And somehow in the formation of the grain, he saw an angel. And he said, that angel beckoned me to come this morning. I've never had those experiences. I know what the Bible says. Irrespective. And I have to put God's word above everything else. And so, yes, I do believe that they had deceived themselves and they were deceiving the people. And in all probability, they believed it could have been the truth. But also, you also have, all the way through the Old and the New Testament, you stop and think about those that troubled God's children in the New Testament. And a lot of it is about money. Brethren, if I could perform miracles, first place I would go is to the nursing homes. I'd get in a car with Jeff and I would go to Louisiana. Whereas now what they do, these modern prophets go to a motel, they rent the convention center, and you got to pay to get in. And then you got to pay for your miracle. That does not sound like the New Testament to me. I'd go to work on Joe's legs. I'd go to work on my own legs, I think. And so in 12, you have that comparison. 13, you have God condemning, verses 1 through 16, the false prophets while they were in Babylon. In verse 5, let's read 5 and 6 for this. And chapter 5 says, "You have not gone up to the breaches, or built up the wall for the house of Israel, that it might stand in battle in the day of the Lord. They have seen false visions and lying divinations. They say, declared the Lord, when the Lord has not sent them, and yet they expect him to fulfill their word. Have you not seen the false visions and uttered the lying divination? Whenever you have said, declares the Lord, although I have not spoken." Then he goes on, he talks about the lying visions. He says, you look at their hands and they have done nothing. In this particular deal, he talks about they have mudded or plastered or white-walled the wall. They're hiding. They believe that it is protecting them. The false prophets will be protected. Brethren, we've got people in this country, this building's not going to protect you. Steel wall's not going to protect you. And God is simply saying, irrespective of what you do, you're not going to hide. You're not going to hide those false visions. You're not going to hide those lies. You cannot be safe simply because you mudded up the wall. He said, I'll tear the wall down. They built the wall and they mudded the wall for their protection. And he said the same people couldn't even get together and make my house, help Israel in their worship of me. And so that's basically what you have in 13, God condemning the false prophets. And then he closes out there, and he also talks about their women who made the What Would Jesus Do bracelets. They had bracelets. They would have the names of their gods, the false gods, and everything on that. They would wear it. It would remind them. And so God condemns the men who were false prophets, and he condemns the women that were false prophets in encouraging and making their idols to the false gods. And so not only are the men, but also the women. And God said, I am going to destroy your wall. Next week, let's go to 16. Here's what I want you to do. Who was it who took over 1,000 people, 990-something men, women, and children to Guyana and killed them? You remember him? Jim Jones. And Jim Jones, in his book, would tell you of the people that he deliberately addressed, preached to, prophesied to. There was a weakness in their nature and their reasoning, their deficiency. They needed attention, and he would preach to that. So when he said, we're going to Guyana, 1,000 people, they all gave him his money. They went to Guyana. Those that were scared and wanted to escape, which was over 400 of them, were terrified of being shot. And then when he knew that there was no more hope for him, he decided he was going to take out 1,000 people. He was deceived. and over 1,000 people. How do you deceive 1,000 people? Paul? Oh, me, Brian?
That's where the term drink the Kool-Aid.
Is that where it originated, is it? Well, I didn't know that. I love coming to Wednesday night class. I learn a lot. Well, I'll be. I probably won't sleep tonight. I'll be working up a sermon on that. But it is sad, though, isn't it? That you can deceive people. And it's still, it doesn't stop. We don't learn. David Koresh, Bhagwan Rajneesh. Every generation has them. And we just don't learn. Appreciate your attention. Next week we'll go into who? 16. And I expect you to do it even though you won't be here. Rick and that are heading out to Texas, and then from Texas they're going up to Trussville, which is just out of Birmingham. Best thing about Trussville is not your children, it's an oyster house. The worst thing in Trussville is they have a fake Harley Davidson motorcycle shop where you look at the catalog and you go and you say, I want to look like this. No, I've never ridden my motorcycle in the rain. You crazy? They're those kind of people, except your children. We're going to miss you, Rick. Yeah, just look at the pictures up at Tail of the Dragon. There are as many gold wings as there are Harleys off the side of the road. Huh?